Chapter 2, matching the workforce to the workload. This is where we get a lot of phone calls. Companies have a very difficult time with dynamic demand curves, whether they're providing a service or making a product. It is incredibly complicated to get the right people in the right place at the right time. And it's very expensive to get this wrong. So, despair.com is a very interesting website. They say achievement. You can do anything you set your mind to when you have vision, determination, and an endless supply of expendable labor. Pharaoh wasn't worried about FMLA issues on Sunday, or double time on Saturdays, or the union rules. They used a wide range of workers, and many of them they did not have to pay. So many of the projects that we work on today are much more complicated than building one of the wonders of the world. Right? We have rules we have to follow, and this creates some expensive scenarios for us. So when we look at the three cost components of schedules and labor strategy, we're looking at labor costs, variable costs, and fixed costs. Now, many of our clients would say, hey, labor is a variable cost. We agree, but we're breaking it out because it's got its own strategy, and we want to separate it for that reason. When we look at shift schedules, we can look at unit cost or cost to service, based on volume and say, what are the right shift schedules to drive the best results for the business? This is just a financial conversation. We want to include employee preferences as well. But in this stage of the game, we're just looking at how do we match the workforce to the workload, especially one that changes. And we find is there's a wide range of schedules and labor strategies that can help you meet your goals. The challenge is some of them are dead ends. And I say it all the time, change is emotional, and it's potentially disruptive. So if you don't have to change, you shouldn't. So let's look at long-term labor strategies. In my example, I've got 3 shift schedules that in a high-growth environment, they dead end. I can't make any more products. I can't deliver any more services after a certain area of volume. Even if there's a labor strategy that costs me a little bit more, but has a long-term lasting effect where I can keep my employees where they are, I should be looking at that for a long-term solution instead of looking at short-term wins that are going to cause long-term pain. The biggest story, and I love to think that the biggest stories I tell are really interesting things about workers that I've interacted with over the last 25 years. Most of our clients tell me that the most impactful thing that I talk about is the actual cost of overtime. Overtime is actually a really effective tool. And when you understand the components of overtime and what the mismatch really costs you, you realize a couple things. Number one is overtime's not that expensive, and idle time is incredibly expensive. So what are the costs of being overstaffed or understaffed? We call this true labor cost, okay? In the chart that we're sharing with you here, you can see a black line, which is the staffing level. This is just an example, okay? Where the green area chart is above that black line, that's my demand, and I don't have enough people to meet demand. Where the green area is below the black line, I've got too many people, potentially idle time unless I send them home, which creates its own challenges. So the trick is to try and get perfectly staffed, okay? So overtime, idle time, sending them home, what does all this cost me, okay? Let's go through the details. Number one is there's 3 key considerations when you look at the fully loaded cost of 1 hourly employee in your facility, okay? We've got base wage, we've got the burden on a straight time basis, and we've got the pay ratio. So in my example, I'm just taking $15 as my base wage. For straight time burden, I'm looking at 35%. Burden is medical, dental, FICA, 401k, all those fringe benefits that we pay employees. And the pay ratio, I'm using in my example, 15% or 1.15. Pay ratio is things like paid time off, holidays, vacations, paid sick leave. It's the total hours that your company pays you compared to the hours you actually work. Okay, so numerator and denominator, a little different. We need to incorporate all 3 of these numbers as we look at the fully loaded cost of 1 hour when you're here working. So first, let's talk about straight time with true labor cost. So first, we take the $15, we multiply it by 1.35, and we multiply that by 1.15, and we get $23.29. That's the fully loaded cost for 1 hour on straight time as an employee. What about overtime? This is where things get a little tricky. On overtime, I take the $15, but I've got to look at time and a half. I have a penalty. I'm over 40 hours, and based on federal law, I need to pay time and a half. So I pay the time and a half. The key question here is, what else do I need to pay? Many of the other things we've already talked about are fixed costs, and they go away after 40 hours. Okay? Do you get more medical benefits because you worked overtime? Do you get more Thanksgiving vacations because you worked overtime? All of those things are fixed and they're gone. The only things that you're really left to pay are FICA, just can't cheat the government, and 401k, because 401ks are typically paid on your total cost. Okay? So when you put that together, we're looking at $24.75. Okay, so it's not that much more expensive than straight time. And if you look at the bottom of the slide here, you're going to see idle time is 16 times more expensive than overtime on an adverse cost basis. That's a lot more expensive, right? So when we look at these adverse costs, the adverse cost of, first of all, of straight time, we're perfectly staffed. The adverse cost of straight time will always be 0. Okay? The adverse cost of idle time, or the additional cost to the company, I'm a packaging operator, and there's no work for me to do. I stand here for an hour. You pay me $23.29. You get no value back. The adverse cost to the company is going to be the full $23.29. They've got to pay all of that money without getting any value. What about the adverse cost of overtime? Let's say I was effective in my first 40 hours, and now I'm saying to you, if I'm your leader, I say, hey, I need you to stay for an additional hour. Could you work a 41st hour? They say yes, they stay for an additional hour. Now, as a good leader, I'm only going to ask them to stay if there's work to do. So we get the value of the $23.29, that's straight time cost, but we have to pay a penalty. And the overtime penalty is only $1.46. Okay? So overtime in most examples is $1 or $2 more expensive. It's not a lot more. So there's some interesting nuances to this when we ask people, so what is your number? And some folks have much higher burden rates, much lower pay ratios, lots of different things going on. Do the math yourself and see about where you sit. You might be surprised. But there's things going on around making the right staffing decision, and it's not just about the money. What if we tell you overtime's $1.46, but your employees hate overtime, and you have shift schedules that are not conducive to flexing up on overtime? Well, two things need to happen. One is we need to talk to the workforce to better understand what they do want to do, but we also have to design labor strategies that will make overtime more palatable to a workforce that's probably already incredibly dedicated and working their tails off today. Staffing at the peak versus staffing at the trough is very, very expensive. If you staff at the peak, you're going to end up with tons of idle time, and that, in my example, is $3 million versus staffing at the trough, which is only $172,000. But again, what do the employees actually want to work? And that's a critical answer that you need. You have to find out, and it's not what does the whole group want, what do individuals want, so we can design and implement labor strategies that work for your entire population, not just for a small subset. So when we look at staffing parabolas, we take everything we've learned about true labor cost and we apply it to your workload. And we say, what if you had one more person in that area? 2 more, 3 more, 4 more? What if you had one less person? What would that do from a cost perspective to your organization? So when we look at all of the different scenarios where you're getting idle time, overtime, or even double time in some scenarios, when does that happen and how does our staffing level impact that? That's what we learned through the analysis called staffing parabolas. We apply the adverse costs, we look at the volumes historically for the last 12 to 24 months, and we learned in many cases that our clients are overstaffed, but they're overstaffed because they don't have flexible labor strategies. It's not they have too many people, it's they can't move them up and down the way they need based on the volumes that they're digesting. One critical piece that you'll learn because of the low cost of overtime on an adverse cost basis is that there's often a staffing level that is a range at the same cost. Meaning in this example, you can look and you can say, wow, at 65 employees, I've got a certain cost structure, which is about the same as when I'm at 85 employees. So I could increase by 20 people from 65 to 85 and not change my labor cost structure. So wow, if they really love overtime, we could be at 65. If they don't love it, we could be at 85. In our example, this was a group that really didn't like overtime. We recommended 105 as the right staffing level. A little bit more idle time, but we dramatically reduced turnover, and that was critical. So for years now, we've been talking about the Affordable Care Act. And it's a political hot button, and there's a lot of opinions about it, right? That this is a huge challenge for our country. There's regulations. If we don't do it the right way, we could go to jail. Listen, the reality is, from a labor perspective, there's one thing that you need to be concerned about, and it's a rising cost of healthcare. It was happening before the Affordable Care Act. When the Affordable Care Act went into place, healthcare started to rise in cost even faster. Why does that matter as a guy that has dedicated 25 years of his life to hourly employees? Is I get concerned about who's going to have a job in the future when overtime becomes even more attractive. So I'll ask you a question. What happens when the burden goes up? Well, half of the percent of the burden, that 35%, generally half of it, is healthcare costs. And by the way, we've seen burdens that are over 100% based on the different healthcare plans and the different pension plans that different companies offer. But with the rising cost of healthcare, the straight time burden is getting more and more expensive, higher and higher and higher. However, healthcare does not fit into the overtime burden calculation. So overtime stays at the same cost. So when I have $23.29 and $24.75, as a straight time burden gets more expensive, healthcare gets more expensive, straight time gets more and more expensive while overtime stays at the same cost. That means for a majority of hourly environments where there's skilled workers, overtime today in the United States is cheaper than straight time. Overtime is now cheaper than straight time in so many of the companies in our country. So does that incent management teams to hire lots of people? No. As benefits rise, the adverse cost of overtime falls, and eventually overtime becomes cheaper, which we're seeing all over the country right now. And then where is the right place to staff? Now, if you're just thinking about money in the short term, you'd say as low as possible. But the reality is, and this is critical, we have to engage the workforce in a real and meaningful way. It's not okay to look at the money and say, let's capture the cost savings, because in the short term it may look great. You're not going to have a workforce to manage if you don't listen to them as well. And generationally, we've got an issue here. People in their 50s and 60s generally are looking for more work and more overtime. People in their 20s and 30s more often want to work a 40-hour work week and not work a whole bunch of overtime. So we've got generational issues we've really got to deal with. Does everybody want overtime? The Ankara Labor Survey tells us that there is a huge chunk of people, 38%, that say they're working less overtime than they want. 34% say they're working the right amount, and only 28% are saying they're working too much, more overtime than they'd like. The reason why these stats are less impactful for you is you've got your own workforce with their own personality and their own points of view on all of this stuff. Okay, so there's a lot of areas where we have benchmarks that will line up perfectly or close to perfectly with a broad range of employees. Overtime is not one of those. Overtime is different everywhere we go. Sometimes different departments have different preferences around overtime. That's why they're in those departments. So you've got to think about this in terms of the individual and not generalize. What happens when you work less than 40 hours? I talked to you about the great value of overtime. It's $1.46 in our example. Well, when your employees work less than 40 hours, those fixed cost benefits are spread over fewer hours as well. That means that the per hour cost for your employees becomes more expensive. So it does work both ways. Here's an example of a dairy manufacturing facility. They made cheese. And when you look at this chart, you see that there's some times where the employee hours lined up with the pounds produced, and they had the right workforce with the workload they were trying to accomplish. But in the middle of the week, Wednesdays and Thursdays, during the low season, they actually didn't have raw materials to make cheese, this cheese manufacturer. And so there was lots of idle time, and they made it up on the weekends. Now, it's not okay to say, hey, overtime's just $1.46, so we can make it up on the weekends. You have to be effective in your first 40 hours before you can take advantage of that low adverse cost number. If you have a bunch of idle time during the week and you're working overtime, you're getting hit with the $23.29 idle time, and you're getting hit with this overtime cost that was really unnecessary. We didn't need it if we were just productive in the first 40 hours. So be careful with how you use these numbers because you've got to be effective in the first 40 if you're going to take advantage of the low cost of overtime.